Okay, hello and welcome everyone. This is the Medical Racism in American Jewish Experience panel discussion. This is an extra special event for us because this is the federally designated Days of Remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust. So this is a special edition of the American Jewish program for this week. We also invite everyone to join us tomorrow for a keynote address with Dr. Aletha Maybank, the Chief Equity Officer of the AMA, for our Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program. So a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this discussion and sending it to everyone who RSVP'd. And also we would ask that you send any questions that you have through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So I'd like to start us off with a special invitation to Vice Chancellor Richards. She will be doing some opening remarks. So Vice Chancellor Regina Richards leads the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement for the CU Anschutz Medical Campus. She is working to develop campus-wide DEI initiatives, which include key performance indicators as a system of accountability. Previous to her current appointment, Dr. Richards was the inaugural director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the CU School of Medicine, where she developed programming, policies, and processes that reach potential future health sciences students to broader campus and community engagement endeavors. Please welcome Vice Chancellor Richards.
Thank you so very much. I am honored to be here today to just give a brief welcome to everyone that is here and to really take a moment and acknowledge this really important issue. Before I do that, I would be totally remiss if I did not read our land acknowledgement. We humbly acknowledge that University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people. Our campus resides on unceded lands of the Arapaho people established on the Treaty of Fort Lerner in 1851. We recognize the enduring presence of more than 40,000 Indigenous peoples in the greater Denver area. The sprawling urban American Indian and Alaska Native presence in Denver consists of other tribes native to Colorado, such as the Apache, Comanche, Shoshone, and Ute community members, yet is now home to numerous other Indigenous people from many of the 560 plus federally recognized tribes in this country. Together, we acknowledge the history of genocide and the ongoing systemic inequities while respecting treaties made of the territory as a step towards recognition and strengthening relationships with Indigenous people. We give thanks to the past, present, and future stewards of this land and respect all tribal nations, sovereignty and right to self-determination. We recognize the lessons, including many medical and public health lessons Indigenous communities have offered and continue to teach us. This issue of racism in medicine is so embedded in our structural systems. I, first of all, again, want to thank Bioethics and Humanities for bringing so many issues to the forefront. Acknowledge this time that we commemorate the genocide that has happened, the atrocities related to that. I know that in the past few years, there has been a chandelier that has highlighted the atrocities of the challenges spanning in our social, political, healthcare, and other areas where discrimination, systemic racism is still very prominent. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, that of all the forms of inequity and injustice, health is the most shocking and most inhumane. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to those who put this together. I'm looking so forward to the dialogue today and want people to know that though this is an event and we are commemorating events, our work has to be all of our responsibilities to move us from injustices to justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Richards. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd also like to thank our partner for this program and tomorrow's program as well, the CU program in Jewish Studies, as well as our planning committees who have worked really hard planning both of these events. It's something that they work on all year. So we're so excited to have everyone with us. Also a special welcome to any students who are joining us today. We encourage you to ask questions. And with that, I'll introduce our moderator, Dr. Matt Wynia, who will introduce the panelists. Dr. Wynia is the director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and among many other things, he's one of the leaders in the field of Holocaust and medicine. So please welcome Dr. Wynia.
Thank you so much, Malia. And I'm really very pleased to be holding this event in the American Jewish Experience in Medicine as part of our Holocaust, Genocide, Contemporary Bioethics programming this year. I do unfortunately have to start with some sad news. One of the key inspirations for this program is Dr. Bill Silvers. And many of the people in the audience probably know Bill, and he was in an accident over the weekend and is currently in one of our intensive care units. I spoke with him yesterday. He's in good spirits, but he will certainly appreciate the hopes and prayers that anyone will send his way for his recovery. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers for today to get us started. And we're going to start with Dr. Barron Lerner. Dr. Lerner is a professor of medicine and population health at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. In addition to research, he practices internal medicine. You can see that he is in his clinic space right now. And he teaches medical ethics and the history of medicine. He is a prolific author. He's written a number of books. The Breast Cancer Wars was actually a bit transformative for me when I first read it years ago. And he publishes extensively in the non-academic press as well. He's well published in the Well blog of the New York Times. He writes for Slate, for the Washington Post. He has numerous appearances on NPR, Fresh Air. He's been on one of my shows that I aspire to ever be on, which is Science Friday. So I admire him for many of his accomplishments, but that in particular. Next, we will have Dr. Alan Kraut. Dr. Kraut is a distinguished professor of history at American University, and he's a non-resident fellow of the Migration Policy Institute. In addition to many other accomplishments, he currently chairs the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island History Advisory Committee for the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation. He specializes in US immigration and ethnic histories and the history of medicine and public health in the United States. He's written a number of very important books, including Immigrant Menace, a book called Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace. He is an elected fellow of the Society of American Historians, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. So we will start with Dr. Lerner. He's going to give some opening remarks. Then Dr. Kraut will give remarks in context of what Dr. Lerner has said. And then we'll have three additional people joining the conversation with different backgrounds on the experiences of racism, Judaism, and the American public health and medical experience. So Dr. Greg Drinkwater will be joining us. He is a visiting assistant professor at the CU Boulder program in Jewish Studies. He really brings an intersectional approach to this topic. His research focuses on sexuality, gender, and Judaism in the United States. He received the 2020 Wasserman Prize for an article in the American Jewish History Journal on queer healing, AIDS, gay synagogues, lesbian feminists, and the origins of the Jewish healing movement. And he's working currently on a project exploring the ways in which AIDS activists like Larry Kramer linked the AIDS crisis and memory of the Holocaust. We will also be joined by Dr. Shanta Zimmer. Dr. Zimmer is the Senior Associate Dean for Education and the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She is a colleague of mine in the Division of Infectious Diseases, and she has received a number of awards for her work on diversity and inclusion, including most recently the Nadine Garcia Faculty of the Year Award from the Student National Medical Association. And if we are lucky, Dr. Aletha Maybank will also be joining us. She is currently in air, coming from New York. She's due to land and will show up on our screen. I think she'll be able to log in as soon as she lands, and then she will show up on screen in time to make some comments. Dr. Maybank is the Chief Health Equity Officer and Senior Vice President at the American Medical Association, where she focuses on embedding health equity across all the work of the AMA, and she leads the Center for Health Equity. She is the inaugural Chief Health Equity Officer at the AMA, and she was the inaugural Director of the Center for Health Equity at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and of the Office of Minority Health prior to that at the Suffolk County Department of Health Services. So Aletha will be joining us as she can when she lands.
She is on the ground, Matt, I can tell you, and
okay.
en route in a vehicle.
Perfect. So Dr. Lerner, I'm going to turn things over to you, and it looks like by my screen, you've got the slides already up. So I think we're ready to go.
Great. Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate the invitation to do this brief talk at this important event. And I'm always a proselytizer for the value of history. So I will try to make my case today as to why historical information and stories are relevant to looking at racism today in medicine. And I wanted to just personally send my best wishes to Dr. Silvers, who I just met last week on that Zoom call, but he's very engaged and engaging person. So I'm hoping for his recovery soon. I'm glad he's on the Zoom call today. So let me forge ahead because we have a lot of interesting speakers. So this is an interesting topic. We could talk about this topic for hours and hours, but I'm going to give sort of a brief overview of a history of Jewish quotas in medicine, and then make a couple of parallel statements about why I think this is relevant for today. And then hopefully this will set us off on a larger conversation of these issues. Okay, now of course my slides were advancing, now they're not. Okay, here we go. So, we're going to be talking about racism for the next hour and a half, and so I thought it would be good to at least put a definition up. A belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And I'm not going to say much more about this, but embedded in there is the false idea that biology and or genetics is equivalent to race. And that has been a false belief for decades. We mentioned the Holocaust. That is basically what drove the Holocaust. And the notion of racial superiority, which we obviously reject. And you'll see the episode that I'm going to talk about how the medical profession was influenced by racist beliefs. Okay, and we're talking about, I'll be talking about Jewish racism against Jews in particular. Again, an enormous topic. This has existed for thousands of years. And as we know, it reached its apotheosis in the 1940s, 30s and 40s during the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. But the era I'm going to be talking about is actually the decades before that, which is, I think, less well known to people, when there was an upsurge of anti-Semitism really around the world. So I'm talking about the 1920s and 30s. And again, the particular ramifications of that in the world of medicine in the United States. So, and I'll call this the era of quotas. And I'm going to be talking about medical school and medical centers. So you have to situate this historically. This era of quotas followed waves of Jewish immigration to the United States initially from Germany and more Western Europe, and later, as we know, Eastern Europe, Russia and surrounding countries. Many settled in New York City on the Lower East Side, but throughout the country. I think it's safe to say that the Jewish immigrants were ambitious. They were very into scholarship, very interested in education. And as a result, they had very high rates. And now I'm talking, around the turn of the 20th century for medical school. That profession and having a career as a physician was potentially very appealing. An enormous, in New York, back in New York City now, that's a photo of City College of New York, where it was free to go, and these were largely poor immigrants. So actually the percentage of students at City College of New York was extremely high for these ambitious Jewish immigrant children who could not afford other schools. So what happened when these students graduating City College and other colleges tried to go to medical school? Well, this is, again, I don't think this story is very well known, but there were informal quotas at many medical schools around the United States. Cornell and Columbia in New York were, I would say, among the most notorious, but there were also quotas at other schools like Harvard and Yale and University of Pennsylvania. In the years prior to the 1928, the students applied. If they were qualified, they got into medical school, and there were actually pretty high rates of Jewish students at many of these schools. But all of a sudden, the numbers began to drop. And there was a tacit understanding, often unwritten at these schools, that they needed to bring the number of Jews down to approximate the Jews in the overall population. So you're talking about 5%, no more than 5% of a student body could be Jewish. This was overtly racist. It was anti-Semitic. What was behind this? Well, we don't have time to talk about the long history of anti-Semitism, but the Jews were perceived as too aggressive, too into money, too powerful, in control of the economy and government, and therefore the numbers needed to be reduced. Willard Rapelye, shown here, was the dean of Columbia Medical School, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, coincidentally later was my alma mater, and was the driving force behind these quotas. Let me tell two stories, because this didn't just happen in medical schools, it happened in medical residencies and in medical departments across the country. Two quick stories, not very well known to the audience, I'm guessing. Montreal, Canada, 1934. A medical student named Samuel Rabinowitz graduates with all sorts of honors from the University of Montreal, very accomplished student, applies for internship locally at the Hôpital Notre Dame in Montreal. He is the one Jewish intern among dozens of other interns. When he starts to work in the summer of 1934, the other interns go on strike. And this is a quote from one of them when they explain why they went on strike. "We do not want him because he is a Jew." So imagine this. The interns literally leave their jobs at the hospital because it's so offensive to them that one of the interns, qualified and inoffensive, is Jewish. I put ironically, they were Catholic. Catholics, of course, have suffered discrimination in history as well, but in this case, they were the discriminators. What does Rabinowitz do in 1934? He does the noble thing. He resigns his position as an intern and memorably does not go into a long diatribe about anti-Semitism, although he was clearly thinking that. And he said, the patients in the hospital are being abandoned because they don't have doctors. It's dangerous for the patients. So he put his patients front and center, left to the United States where he trained, and happily later returned to Montreal and became a revered doctor. He saw patients into his 90s and was somewhat vindicated. But that's just one of many, many examples of anti-Semitism at this era. Second example, now we're a little later in the 1940s, back at Columbia, unfortunately. In the late 1930s, as the Nazis took over Germany, Austria, and other countries, physicians fled, the lucky ones, got to the United States in many cases. And in New York, there were a number of neurologists who arrived from Europe, one of whom was a very well-known neurologist named Otto Marburg, a personal friend of Sigmund Freud. Columbia Neurology Service quietly hired these, I believe, 5 of these neurologists, and anticipating that there might be trouble, they created 2 services of attending neurologists, one that had Jewish doctors and one that didn't, with the sense that if patients didn't want to be cared for by Jewish doctors, the other neurologists could see them. An interesting solution. It was the mastermind of this man, Tracy Putnam, who was the chair of neurology at Columbia, who was not Jewish. He was actually a Boston Brahmin. But it didn't last for long when the Dean Rapoli, who we showed you before, and others at Columbia caught word of what had happened. They didn't like it at all. They basically said to Putnam, you need to fire all those Jewish neurologists. We don't want them here. And Putnam refused and was forced to resign. Basically, they said, we're going to fire you if you don't do it. He declined and resigned his post in 1947. We'll come back to him at the very end. Why are these stories so important? Oh, one last slide before I get to that. Very quickly, and I know Alan Kraut's going to pick up on this. Happily, after World War II, the quotas really abated. And there's many reasons given for this. One is that the revulsion at what had happened to the Jews during the Holocaust sort of sent a message to others in this and other countries about the wrongness of anti-Semitism. So it was sort of a reverberation of that. And fortunately, that's one of the reasons quotas declined. Second was both at the federal level, Harry Truman, and at state level, Tom Dewey, the governor of New York, investigated what had happened with discrimination more largely at educational institutions in New York and the United States, and denounced it. And finally, as we're going to talk about in a moment, Jewish philanthropists and doctors started their own institutions to admit Jewish students and to employ Jewish doctors. Okay, last couple slides. Why does all this matter? Why does history matter? I'm going to argue that this story of Jewish quotas in a 20-year period in the 1930s and 1940s is emblematic of a larger problem in medicine, of racist, unfortunate racist behavior within the medical profession at medical centers. And you can see from this slide, I'm alluding in large part to what has occurred with Black patients and Black physicians and other professionals within medicine. This has gotten a lot of attention recently after the murder of George Floyd. And I put the Flexner report here. There was a recent paper that showed how the famous Flexner report that supposedly revolutionized medical education in 1910 actually closed many of the existing Black medical schools and prevented Black medical Blacks from entering medical school and becoming part of the medical profession. These episodes and how we remember them are historically contingent. We need to remember why these things happen at a particular time in history, and also that our responses to them are historically contingent. So the Holocaust was a terrible event, but it did lead us to revisit the ways in which quotas were being used prior to the Holocaust. And similarly, the terrible death of George Floyd and other Black individuals at the hands of police and other elements of our society has led medicine to look at its own house and admit and realize that Black patients and Black students and Black physicians and other Black professionals have been discriminated against in flagrant ways by the AMA and other organizations, and that needs to stop. Last slide. I do want to remind everybody what historians do when they look at this, which can be tricky, but I think is a very important last point. The best historical scholarship does not look back and judge. It might seem like I've been doing that the whole talk, but I've been trying not to. In other words, it's not enough to say from the perspective of 2022, I'm looking back at the quotas that those schools put in against Jewish university students and saying, we would never do that. We're enlightened now. We don't do that sort of thing anymore. That's not so helpful. What's more helpful, where you can really learn from history, is to put yourself back in a historical period and look at the choices that historical figures had and what they decided to do. And we've seen a lot of evidence of people like Dr. Rapoport, who did the wrong thing, who was, when confronted with an issue of Jewish students at his school, blatantly discriminated against them. But we also have stories of people doing the right thing. So Tracy Putnam didn't owe anything to anybody, I believe, and he gave up his job in order to try to save the jobs of the Jewish neurologists that he'd hired. He did the right thing. When it was a time that it would be easily at an institution where the easy thing to do would be to just act in an anti-Semitic way, he refused to do so. And so too, I wanted to mention that during this era, when many medical schools were putting quotas in for Jewish students, other medical schools did not. And here's a couple from New York City in particular, that when we go back historically and look, we see that New York University, my current institution, the Long Island College of Medicine, which later became Downstate, and other schools rejected quotas and rejected the reflexive anti-Semitism that so many others demonstrated. And I leave us with this picture today. Among the most moving things I've seen at my medical school and other medical schools in the last few years are gatherings like this and pictures like this, where students themselves are rejecting racism, rejecting discrimination, and the hope is that we can do better in medicine and do well by our current students of color and be a better profession. So I'll stop there. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lerner, for those inspiring and distressing equally comments. And I want to invite Alan Kraut. Dr. Kraut, you've seen the slides in advance, so you had a little bit of notice on what Dr. Lerner was going to cover. And I want to give you first shot at responding and reflecting on what he has said, and maybe expanding as well in areas that you think might be helpful for our conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I want to add my best wishes to Dr. Silvers for his recovery, and we all hope that Bill's on the mend and back with us really, really soon. I guess as I reflect on what Barron has talked about this afternoon, one of the things that I want to respond to is, how did Jews respond to the challenges of anti-Semitism? At least one rabbi, Morris Lazaron, conducted a survey of medical school deans in the 1930s because he wanted to try and understand the perspective of these deans with respect to their quotas. Why the Jewish quotas? What did the Jewish quotas mean? And one of the striking things about the responses, he sent out 65 letters. He got 44 responses in the mid-1930s. And the response was that it wasn't so much the inherent Jewishness of the applicants that concerned these medical deans, Many acknowledged that some of their best students were Jews, but rather the belief that many patients were uncomfortable with Jewish doctors, that the cultural divide between those who were coming into medical school and seeking to practice medicine was at the core of the problem. As one dean said, and I'll quote it directly, the Russian Jewish family is made up of intensely aggressive people who have personal difficulties, who were born in Europe and whose parents have recently migrated from Europe and are apt to be entirely different type, sometimes radical, sometimes asocial, often unstable. And it's that depiction of Jewish medical students and young Jewish doctors, which was one of the things that Rabbi Lazaron came to understand from these medical deans. But that was not the only response. Taking a survey is very nice, but it's hardly adequate response. A more meaningful response, I think, was the creation of Jewish institutions that would nurture Jews in medicine. And here, of course, I'm talking about the Jewish hospital in the United States. The first Jewish hospital was organized in Cincinnati in 1849. The second in the early 1850s in New York, Jews Hospital, which was renamed Mount Sinai in the 1860s. And certainly by the time of World War II, there were about 60 different institutions, right, including the one behind you, Matt, that bore the name Jewish one way or another. And in addition to providing an atmosphere in which Jewish patients could heal in a culturally sensitive environment, they also nurtured Jewish professionalism. Jewish nurses, Jewish doctors, the opportunity for Jewish physicians to rise up in staff positions and do research and so on. Many of those opportunities having been denied them in non-Jewish institutions, whether they were institutions controlled by other religious denominations or secular institutions run by municipal governments. It was often an uncomfortable and an unyielding kind of environment for young Jews who wished to enter medicine. So that was another response. But as Barron was speaking, I was thinking about something else as well, not just the issue of Jews and professionals in medicine and applications and schools, but rather the overall reaction on the part of non-Jewish physicians to the Jewish patient, something we don't often think about. But I want to read you a short quotation from Dr. Richard Cabot, a Boston physician who, writing in the early years of the 20th century, describes his own personal reaction in a very candid way to the Jewish patients who came through his door. He writes, "As I sit in my chair behind the desk, Abraham Cohen of Salem Street approaches and sits down to tell me the tale of his sufferings. The chances are 10 to 1 that I shall look out of my eyes and see not Abraham Cohen, but a Jew. Not the sharp, clear outlines of this unique sufferer, but the vague, misty composite photograph of all the hundreds of Jews who in the past 10 years have shuffled up to me with bent back and deprecating eyes and taken their seats upon the stool to tell me their story. I see a Jew, a nervous, complaining, whimpering Jew, with his beard upon his chest and the inevitable dirty black frock coat flying about his knees. I do not see this man at all. I merge him in the hazy background of the average Jew," end quote. That's a pretty powerful statement. And it suggests that the problems of anti-Semitism in medicine were not just the problems that governed admissions to medical school or staff positions in medicine, but it was a much larger issue that involved the actual treatment of patients. If this is what a doctor saw when he looked at his patient, can you imagine then what even less enlightened people than Dr. Cabot might have seen when they looked at a Jewish patient. And not only did they have a sort of stereotypical, hateful image that came to their mind, but it actually bled into the diagnosis. One popular diagnosis for Jews in this era is called Hebraic debility. And Hebraic debility was a kind of neurasthenia, a nervous disease that supposedly Jews had and others did not. This diagnosis was refuted by Jewish physicians, Dr. Hyman Morrison, who wrote a very, very fine paper in a New England journal at one point, spoke to the issue of Hebraic debility and refuted the whole notion and mounted evidence to do that. And there were other Jewish physicians who were doing much the same thing at that time. So when we talk about racism and we talk about anti-Semitic racism, and remember Jews were regarded as a separate race in this era, we're talking about something that had broad-ranging, far-reaching implications, even to how a patient might be treated after a diagnosis. So I think I'd like to open up the discussion that way for some other questioners and talk about this, because for sure, we know that it involves other groups, how they're medicated, how they're treated when they go in to see a physician, how they're regarded when they go into a medical institution. African Americans today often face some of the same problems that Jews did at the turn of the century in terms of how they're treated, how they're regarded by those who are going to supposedly offering them healing. Matt, did you want to ask?
Yes, I have to unmute
You
myself.
look like you were about to say something, that's why.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate your starting to broaden this out as well to what sort of lessons can be learned. And I wonder if I could turn to Greg next for a few comments in particular about the sort of intersectionality and the ways in which discriminatory behaviors and actions end up affecting people, in a variety of different sort of contexts and ways. And I know this is an area where you've done some work, so I think maybe as we get into this intersectional space, I'd love for you to start us off.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I guess actually directly following up to Alan Kraut's comments about patient outcomes and discrimination in treatment, I'd like to build a little bit on that and mention that Jews built some of their own medical institutions, and I've seen some questions in the chat about that. Institutions being built as a direct response to systemic discrimination against both healthcare providers, but also patients themselves. But of course, Jews weren't the only marginalized communities who did this, right? So hospitals and clinics were also founded, for example, within the Black community in the 19th and 20th centuries, and are in many ways some of the richest examples of these kind of alternative healthcare spaces, that have some pros and cons. Some of them were certainly high quality field defining institutions, but also some of them were institutions born of segregation and offered sort of separate but unequal care and provisions for their patients. I think something that I'd like to focus in is maybe to get us a little bit more towards a sort of more contemporary perspective, is to think a bit about what happened starting in the 1960s, when we see a wave of grassroots and activist movements focused on health justice among marginalized populations and bringing an expressly activist political perspective to issues of health inequity and lack of equal access, right? So these are groups of people who, looking to the mainstream medical establishment, saw a lack of interest in, or maybe a lack of focus or awareness of their own particular health challenges. So they took up those issues themselves, sometimes as lay activists, sometimes in collaboration with and supported by other medical professionals. So I'm thinking of examples like the birth of the women's health movement in the 60s and 70s. The most well-known example probably being the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, who created the famous Our Bodies, Ourselves in the early 1970s. And by the way, a disproportionate number of women involved in that group and also national women's health groups were Jewish. side note. Other examples being, of course, the Black Panthers and their creation of people's free medical clinics in the late 60s, the Chicano movement's creation of storefront clinics in the 70s, gay health activism, which actually emerges before AIDS, reaching out to gay populations who are being underserved or misserved in relationship to sexually transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted infections in the 1970s. And of course, then AIDS activism in the 80s. And again, there a disproportionate role for Jews. For example, GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis, founded in 1982 as both an AIDS activist and AIDS service organization, becomes the largest AIDS service organization in the world. The majority of the founders were Jewish, right? And one thing that all of these movements share is a common thread of critiquing unequal access to health resources and creating institutions as grassroots activists. They're also contributing to putting illness into the public sphere so that they're decentering medical professionals as the sole arbiters of health and breaking down the barriers that had previously relegated questions of health and illness to the realm of private concerns, right? So much of our contemporary capacity to talk, very openly and freely about many medical issues is in part a result of this activism, the sort of surfacing of things that had previously been stigmatized or taboo, right? And it also contributes to a significant shift away from an exclusive reliance on medical authority in relationship to the body, towards more personal autonomy and responsibility for one's own body. And sometimes to challenges against the decision-making of medical professionals, right? AIDS activists are really, again, a great example for that in the 1980s and 90s, who ultimately, through their activism, managed actually to contribute to multiple significant changes in how the US government regulates drug trials, for example, or compassionate use protocols, for example, right? Although, of course, some of the negatives of that are with us today. General public questioning of public health protocols around the pandemic being one example, or doctors, repeated frustration with patients Googling, medical treatments or symptoms and coming into the office sort of with a ready-made plan of what they want to do, right? This democratization of health has had both some, massive positives, but also some challenges for medical professionals. And I could talk about that more directly in relationship to AIDS and to LGBT health activism, and certainly happy to talk about that more, but I'll hand it back over to everyone else.
Yeah, Greg, I do want to come back to that because I think there's some ground to be tilled there. Before we do that, though, I wanted to see if Aletha is online with us, and if she is, I wanted to sort of ground the remaining conversation in our shared understanding of racism. Barron put up a dictionary definition of racism, and I dare say I think there are different visions people have in their heads for what racism means, and there are some who probably picture whites only water fountains and differential seating on the bus or explicit discriminatory programs. And yet, as we've heard today, there's a lot of racism that's sort of either an unwritten rule, like these quotas that were described, which were not, written down and set up as law. They were just acknowledged as the way we do business. And then beyond that, there are implicit ways in which people are treated differently and experience discrimination. And I'm wondering, assuming that we no longer see overt, explicit rules that say, we will not accept Black students in our student body, for example, how are we seeing the experience of racism play out today? And I wanted to turn to Aletha because I know you've done a lot of thinking about this. And this may be a bit of a softball given the way the AMA Office of Health Equity came into being and some of the controversies at the AMA recently about what it means to express implicit bias, what it means to express implicit racism. But I would love to give you a chance to explore with us and to sort of level set. How does racism show up in medicine today?
Sure. Hi, and thanks, Matt. Everybody can hear me? Good. Okay, thanks, Matt, for inviting me today, and it's an honor to be on the panel with everyone and to be in Denver. I've caught my breath from running from the airport, but really awesome to be here. So, you know, I think at this point in time, as we move forward to do this work, I think absolutely critical on what you're elevating, Matt, is the importance of having a shared analysis, shared language, of which we all are able to accept and move forward with. And I think that that is one of our challenges and opportunities, especially in this country. And I'll speak, you know, a little bit about it today, but also tomorrow about its comparisons also with the Holocaust and Germany's kind of way forward, and how they developed, you know, a shared analysis so that they could move forward to atone for the past and the atrocities of the Holocaust. But how we're still kind of challenged in this day because we can't agree on definitions such as racism. And so I really call upon, you know, experts who have been doing this well before my time, and really Kamara Jones is one of, to me, you know, the leading experts in the space of health, you know, for years. But looking to her definition that says that racism is a system, right? So the ism part is a system. It's of power, but also oppression. It assigns value and structures opportunity based on skin color. So those are two parts of it, right? And then the other piece of it is that ends up advantaging some people, so typically whites in this country. But if we talk about the intersections, it's white men who are usually Christian, able-bodied, and identify as straight and non-immigrant, and disadvantages those people who are not white. So they're of color. There's so many different terms also that we use kind of at this day, and it's hard to have a sense of where to exactly be. But the idea is that it's also rooted based on skin color, right? There's a hierarchy on skin color. So that's the definition of racism that I go with. Kamara also goes on to say that it saps society of its full potential because we are never able to fully realize the opportunity, and actually the opportunity to see each other and each other's humanity, to fully kind of engage in that way. And it shows up whether in our interactions as human beings or our opportunities around work and our expressions in art, because we are so segregated and separate as a society. And Isabel Wilkerson talks a lot about this in caste, and how this caste system that has been created, of which racism is a part of, really creates this sense of we have our lane that we need to be in, and we have to stay in that lane. And it shows up whether interpersonally, in our systems and our culture, as well as our policies and our laws and our structures. And the other part that I'll say, just kind of tied to the definition, is that I feel as a way to move forward, and it goes back a little bit to the definition that I just gave, is that we have to name kind of white supremacy as the ideology more often as a fuel for racism, and almost vice versa, right? And this false notion of a hierarchy of human value. It's the same kind of tactic and strategy that was used in the Holocaust, this hierarchy of human value based on, in this country, it's skin color, and there are other hierarchies that exist, but it's been so embedded into every aspect of our society that it's almost difficult for people to see. But it is the ultimate strategy that is used to keep these systems of power and oppression really in place in our country. So at the interpersonal level, so racism usually there's the interpersonal racism that exists. There's, you know, kind of the systemic cultural racism that exists. And then there's kind of the structural racism that exists. Interpersonal is the one that folks, you know, tend to you see the most, right? It's our experiences. Some of those were mentioned, the experiences that our patients have when they're in our healthcare setting, and they're discriminated against, or, you know, or they're not listened to, or they're not valued, or something is said to them explicitly. Even as providers, I reflect on this, and I'm sure several of us reflect on this with many different identities, that, you know, when we go into the room sometimes as Black providers or other providers of color, or even those, you know, who are identified as disabled, we're not looked at as the physician. and not that there's anything wrong with any of the other professions to be viewed or considered that, but we usually are not oftentimes considered the physician. And so, those are types of interpersonal interactions, and you get told things because of that, or what you can and can't do because of that. And then when you look at kind of more the system level, I think about in medicine, there are so many things to think about and consider, but the lack of diversity that still exists across race and ethnicity in this country as it relates to physicians of color. And a lot of that as AMA, we've had to kind of acknowledge our own history of our connections to Flexner, Matt, you're very well familiar with, and the recommendations of that report of closing 5 of the 7, or the recommendations led to the closure of 5 of the 7 med schools, 7 Black med schools, which has had tremendous impact to this day. And so there's also kind of what we see in the space of medicine, when I think from a system, in terms of like the images. If you look at what's in our textbooks or the educational tools that are used, they're predominantly of white individuals. That has an impact on how we as physicians and as a community really lacks an understanding and a desire and a value for people of all types of backgrounds. And that's come up more and more today. And I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow in my keynote as well. And then there's the kind of the structural level. And I think the structural pieces are where a lot of, I've been in public health most of my career, actually. I'm just now more so in the space of medicine and healthcare. Public health speaks more to these larger contexts of what creates health, has a broader narrative. And I think that impacts people's health overall, because we don't tend to look at in this country overall, but even from the space of medicine, that health is really, the kind of your ability to build wealth, right? Whatever types of education that you have access to and the opportunities around that. Even how the healthcare systems are built up and sustained within communities as well. We know there's still lots of separate, even though it's not law, but there's still a lot of separate and not equal services that exist amongst communities within this country. And so those structures and the ways in which people can build wealth, can have education, transportation, and employment are very much determined by laws and policies that have been put forward, right? And oftentimes those ideologies of hierarchy, because it has been people and men who put those structures and laws in place, have these lenses that have been used to create them. So they show up in ways that do discriminate, that do exclude, that do marginalize people historically, as well as in this present day. And so I think, when we start to really dig into this work, and for me, as I've moved forward in doing it, I'm really trying to find areas of just greater solidarity around talking about the context of oppression and hierarchy, because I feel it's an absolute strategy of white supremacy from an ideology point of view, and that the false notion of hierarchy to divide us and for us to feel like and think that we're not like others and that we shouldn't be with others and move with others. Somebody mentioned the Black Panthers earlier. That is something that the Black Panthers realized through the Rainbow Coalition. And that's why they became, from the government lens, very dangerous, because they understood this opportunity around solidarity. Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, talks about the solidarity dividend and how we are better and stronger. And it seems a little kind of jargony to say better and stronger together. But the reality is that, this false notion and this lie that has been told to us is what prevents us from moving forward.
I think we're getting into really useful and also controversial areas here. So I'm gonna, and I didn't tell Shanta I was gonna bring her in on exactly this note, but I think it's important. You are in a position where you're seeing who gets admitted to medical schools. You're seeing the process. We've seen enormous change in the way we think about who gets admitted to medical school over the last few decades. And we've had a number of questions now come up in the Q&A about this question of looking at the racial gender makeup of who comes into medical school. And I want to, the reason this is a little controversial, and I wish I had warned you in advance I was going to ask you this, is because what we're getting in the chat are questions about, there are a high proportion of Asian Americans who get admitted to medical school today. That sounds, similar to what was happening when Dr. Lerner was referring earlier to, the 1930s and 40s. And you're seeing a similar kind of racist, but it's a pushback. And I will say, by the way, we've had an overrepresentation of white men in medical school for many, many years, with not a lot of pushback, for most of that time. So how do we think about sort of the balance of a medical school class today, recognizing the legacy cost of what has happened in the past, but also, not wanting to balance on the backs of a community that is, otherwise doing very well in the United States on some measures?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Matt. I really enjoy the complexity of the discussion. A couple of things. I think this is exactly why we're having a conversation about why history is important, right? Mm-hmm. We want to understand the unintended consequences of changes to policies and processes, and exclusion of entire groups of people. And at the same time, recognize that we can't just pay attention to the pieces of history that we choose to pay attention to. We have to pay attention to all of history. And some of the things that Dr. Maybank is bringing up is related to the structural racism that has been part of history that we don't pay attention to. And so I think we have to pay attention to all of those pieces of history and do the work to dismantle the structures that are leading to the outcomes of the differential acceptance rates, not just in medical school, but in colleges as well. And then we have to redefine what we mean by our metrics and our admissions processes and standards, because those were created in those historical structures. And if we're talking about changing the outcomes of patient populations, which is what all medical schools should be thinking about, then we need to understand what type of physicians should be created to address those differential outcomes. And for example, we know that having providers, Black physician providers, will change the outcomes of the patient population, not just for, in my area like yours, influenza outcomes or acceptance of the influenza vaccine, for example, but for cardiovascular disease and for strokes and for cancer outcomes. And so I really am unapologetic about the fact that we want to change the health outcomes. And in order to do that, we have to have a more racially diverse medical school class physician workforce. And I think as long as we're driving towards those outcomes, then, really there's no room for pushback or criticism of the strategies the medical schools are using to admit a more diverse class of students.
Yeah, go ahead. Please.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So the other thing I want to bring up, history was brought up. So Kamara Jones's other framework that I rely on as well, in terms of, how do we know that racism is existing, in our society or systems in our medical, space. And her framework has three things, right? One, we need to value all people equally. And so, many of us will say, of course I do that. I value all people equally, right? It's our nation says we do that, and of course I do that. But the reality is like, if we look at our systems and if the data tells us that there are disparities that exist, there are a number of differences, right? That's what we're all talking about. Our systems don't value all people equally. That's the bottom line of it. And I try to kind of just repeat that is a sign that something is happening, that there's a power differential that is often happening, that is allowing that. There is a narrative that is happening for that difference. And so we aren't valuing all people equally, and we need to strive towards that. The second part is looking at our historical context and reckoning with that, and understanding that we are here today in part of the history that we have put forward as an institution, as well as a society at whole. And then the third part is about redistribution of resources to the places at most need, right? And that's come up lots during this COVID time. And that also is a power conversation, right? Who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to inform those decisions of the redistribution of finances and other opportunities and resources that exist? I say that because if we don't utilize a framework to advance equity, I'll use that frame kind of overall in the context of looking at all the isms that exist, whether it's racism or ableism, sexism, classism, xenophobia, all of that. We won't get to that point of wanting to do equity, and we have to really work to interrogate ourselves around that. And so when I think about med school admissions, there are schools that do it, right? And more so now, like I graduated from Temple, I did their white coat ceremony, and the diversity in their class is tremendous in their first year class. It's possible. I think, and when folks say we have to dig into the pipeline is important. There's a lot we need to do to strengthen the pipeline, but the reality, there are enough students right now who are ready and willing and able, if allowed to go into med school. And we're starting to see schools, we see it this year, that the diversity numbers are better and they are improved. I look at the historically Black medical schools. They figured it out, and so I think we have to challenge ourselves a little bit more around, what are those real barriers of why we have not done better when we really have an environment where we can do better with the diversity that happens within our schools. And then the last part I'll bring up is also, I believe, increasing the diversity is like the right thing to do. That's reflective of our nation's population, or reflective of the community maybe that you're serving. I think there's always a debate around that, right? In that part, but and there's more conversation in that. And I think that there's an importance to doing that. I don't think we should be excluding. I think we should again be looking at numbers and how we value and how we don't value. Race concordance, there's budding data on that, but I err and just stress to make sure that we're not putting the burden of being able to take care of marginalized patients upon Black patients or providers or LGBTQ providers or providers that are with disabilities. As physicians, we should be able to care for all patients. And we have data that shows that doesn't happen. We have the more recent data that shows that babies born to white physicians are, let me clarify that, white babies born to white physicians do well, whether they're taken care of by Black physicians or white physicians, and Black babies born to Black physicians do well, but white physicians not, right? So this is recent data. That shouldn't be. And so I just, again, I don't want the reliance to be on race concordance. We will never have enough physicians that don't identify as white men to be able to take care of the entire population. So we all need to be able to care for patients, no matter our background.
I should clarify that I also agree that we shouldn't have concordance but that the practice, the providers in the group, actually the entire practice provides better care if it's a more diverse group of physicians to all of their patients. And the same is true for our scientific outcomes as well. Moving away from this perspective of, just changing the face or matching the population that you're serving, but actually increasing the diversity of whatever team it is creates better outcomes.
Absolutely.
I wonder if I could turn back to the historians for a minute, because what we heard are several different ways in which the Jewish community responded to the racism and discrimination that they have experienced over generations, decades, certainly. And I wonder if there are, things that are popping up in your mind in terms of models or strategies or tactics that a marginalized community can use, and what has been effective over time in terms of within the Jewish community's response. Are there things to be learned? And I'm not sure who to start with, but maybe Barron, if you've got a comment. And I just want to run through the historians for a moment and see, how can we learn from this history?
Well, yeah, I'll say a couple of things and let Ellen I mean, one thing was mentioned already was trying, there's two different paths. You could create your own institutions and structure parallel with the structure that isn't working. I think in the case of the Jewish community at the time, that was seen initially as the only thing you could do for a while. And, frankly, there were people willing to fund these things. They were able to get people like Albert Einstein on board and found the Einstein Medical School. So there was a lot of philanthropy that was available to do that. In the long run, the stuff that has been suggested by, especially Aletha and Chancellor to some degree, you have to look at your own institutions and admit what's been going on and not be so defensive. I think maybe I'm speaking personally here, but a lot of what I think has occurred, certainly that I've seen, is reasonable suggestions about increasing diversity, admitting you're part of a profession that has gotten it wrong for a long period of time. That's why we look back. You can do better. These are things we can learn from the past. That's where you start. And you say that we, as an institution that's predominantly white, can do a better job. And so I think some institutions have done a better job of, and I'm no expert at this, Aletha probably knows more about this than anybody, some institutions have done a better job of increasing discussion of diversity, taking it seriously, working hard to increase not only the presence of Black and other minority students and physicians, and others have not done as good a job. So, I think there's no one right or wrong answer. I think, but I think a part of it for me is like just taking a breath and not being so defensive and looking at ways you can do better than your predecessors have.
I want to jump into something about that, about the creating separate or parallel institutions, and the history of that going back to the 1800s and early 1900s particularly. And I mentioned this other way that occurred in the 60s and 70s. And I think something that they share in common is a response to one of two things, or both, depending on the context, of significant and seemingly unclimbable walls and barriers that basically made the possibility of accessing equitable care or accessing professional opportunities in other institutions either impossible or severely limited, or they're responding to crisis. So the AIDS activists of the 1980s responding to crisis, the women's health movement had a sense of crisis at the time. The Black Panthers had a sense of crisis in the late 60s, right? So as long as the existing medical institutions, whether the medical schools or hospitals, are not paying as much attention or enough attention to those two factors, we're going to see these questions continuing to emerge, right? So it's about directing attention to moments of crisis and responding adequately and honestly, and recognizing the barriers and the walls. And I think, for a large extent, it seems there's a lot of progress towards recognizing the barriers and the walls, but I wonder to what extent crises are still breaking out and driving people to wonder what place there is for them in American medicine.
Yeah, I would say two things. One about institutions and responding to the issue of the Jewish hospital or the Jewish clinic and so on. That was a moment, that was a phase in the history of the Jewish experience in this country, and a response to the prejudices and the hate that we talked about earlier. Had there not been barriers, there probably would not have been Jewish hospitals, or there would have been many fewer of them. But it was a response in the moment. And as the prejudice against Jews, the anti-Semitism dissipated, especially after the Second World War, and Jews began to be promoted through the ranks in hospitals and research opportunities developed. There was much less of an emphasis on maintaining Jewish hospitals. And in fact, today there's really a handful of independent Jewish hospitals. Most of them have merged with other institutions. It was a phase in the medical history of the United States. I want to say something, though, about historical memory and how memory and history can serve to diminish hatred and to understand suspicions. No one has yet mentioned the Tuskegee syphilis experiment that ran between 1932 and 1972, and the implications of Tuskegee for African-American consciousness of white bias within medicine. I mean, if there was ever a moment in time when that bias was as blatant and as obvious, it was when, in fact, some African-American sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the American South were designated an experimental population to understand what syphilis does to the body. Not white bodies, but African-American bodies. And how that entire experiment was conducted, how long it took for it to finally be terminated, the circumstances under which it was terminated, and so on, explains an awful lot about the legitimate African-American suspicions of the American medical establishment overall. If you eliminate that from the discussion, if you, for some reason you engage in a kind of historical amnesia and don't remember things like that, you'll never begin to understand the reticence and the legitimate concerns that African Americans have about accepting what the contemporary American medical establishment has to say to them, whether it's about COVID vaccines or anything else. And so I think part of the remedy, if you will, is education, is educating physicians in the variety of patients who are going to come into their offices, in what their concerns are, what the history of the group has been, the biases that have been exercised against a group at a particular time in the past, and to know that everybody comes into that room. When the doctor comes into the room and the patient comes into the room, they both have histories. And unless you understand what their histories were and where they're coming from culturally and socially, you can't really understand how these two are going to interact in order to get the patient well, for healing to go on in that room, instead of just cultural confrontation. So I think that's that issue of historical memory and pondering the meaning of the experiences of the physician and the patient is very, very important. And that's where history comes in.
Yeah. You know, so bringing history forward again, I am reminded by what you're saying of the fact that we are, in addition to being more aware of racism against a number of minority groups, minoritized groups, we are also seeing a rising level of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. I think we cannot, as one of the people put in the Q&A, can't forget the Tree of Life Synagogue, and there have been a number of other really very overt acts of anti-Semitic racism. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts on, I apologize, I don't have a particular person I think might have the answer to this, but why is this happening now? And is there something we can learn from the historical, you know, as you mentioned, Alan, this rise of Jewish hospitals was a period in history that was in response to a specific set of events and circumstances. What are the events and circumstances that are driving this today? And what do we as a community do about that?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I expect you to have an answer to that, Alan.
Great.
If you could just...
No, I don't have an answer to that, except to say one thing, and that is that if you want to understand anti-Semitism in the United States, you have to understand that 11 people were murdered at the Tree of Life Synagogue. That 11 people was the largest, bloodiest day in the history of the Jews in America. It's a remarkable statement. You can't make that statement about the Ukraine. You can't make that statement about Russia or Germany, or for that matter, England or France, if one goes back a few centuries. And so understanding anti-Semitism in the United States is in part understanding the form that it takes. In other societies, it's been wildly violent. In the United States, it's been very largely exclusionary, whether we're talking about the quotas that Barron started us off with, or we're talking about other kinds of exclusion from law firms, business firms, what have you. That's the form that anti-Semitism has generally taken. Of late, it's become much more violent. And in part, one could argue that permission for that violence has been given by people who are prominent in government, whether it's the President of the United States in the past administration or others as well. But I think it's important to understand that there's different kinds of anti-Semitism that have been more prevalent in some countries in certain periods than in others. What to do about it is much more problematic. I think one has to deal with it as it appears and as it affects one's life. I'm not particularly a pacifist, and I don't particularly think that when violence is exercised against me or my group, I have an obligation to respond in a pacifist kind of way. On the other hand, I think we need to embrace the law enforcement establishment that's supposed to protect us and make clear our expectations of that protection at all times. Other than that, one can hope that this is a phase we're going through that's going to pass. And again, let's look at it in the larger context of how anti-Semitism has manifested itself in the United States. If you compare the bloodiest day in American Jewish history to the number of lynchings of African Americans in the American South, and how long it has taken us to pass an anti-lynching bill in this country, which only recently was signed by the President of the United States, it serves to remind us of how violence has played itself out among different groups in this country and at different times.
I wonder. Yeah, I was going to turn to you, Barron.
Okay.
Actually, next. So I'd love to hear what you have to say on that topic, and I want to tie this to medical education. And I'm wondering, because you started us off with the importance of being able to learn from this history, and yet, we know, for example, that only about 15% of medical schools in the US and Canada have any required curriculum on the legacy of medical participation in the Holocaust. There's an enormous body of work going on now on the DEI front, but as far as I know, very little of it is tying to this history of anti-Semitism and the medical role in the public health framing of human beings as being biologically superior and inferior. The whole white supremacy context is, and has been framed around biology. And I'm wondering, what are the barriers that you see to bringing this complex history into the classrooms of medical schools?
I'll be quick, because I know other people probably have comments as well. What I was going to say, following up on Alan, was that I think we're seeing a larger growth of intolerance now in general, not just against Jews. So I'm thinking of the anti-Asian violence we've seen post-COVID, and the ongoing violence against Black individuals in this country, and I think it behooves, on the chat, I'll spill the beans that people have been kicking around this article that was in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, thank you.
I didn't read, about keeping politics out of the medical office. That was the argument of the author. I think I disagree with that completely. And I would also say you shouldn't keep it out of medical education. doctors, health practitioners, nurses, we have the highest calling of taking care of the sick. And we should not shy away from what's going on in our society now, even though it has political ramifications. So I think that it behooves all medical schools, osteopathic schools, any health professional school to, in an ongoing way, work on their curricula and incorporate this. And you know, one of the ironies at our place, so many people got involved in an anti-racist curriculum. I got feedback from the students in something that we had organized in the bioethics group that enough already. Everyone comes and teaches us this. So we were it was a little frustrating for us because we'd worked harder at it and we thought we had an additional perspective, but you just don't want to do this in an episodic manner. This should be these types of discussions, the history of medicine in particular, and what has happened and how medicine has treated its students and its patients of disadvantaged groups and minority groups should just be part of the regular curriculum, and everyone at the school should work together to devise this curriculum and update it, because this is a living, breathing thing, and events in society change, and you incorporate the new events and teach them as well.
Shanta, I wonder if you have comments on how to integrate history into a medical education curriculum, which is incredibly crowded and often very forward-looking, right? Usually what we're talking about is advanced technologies and the latest understandings of this and that and the other thing. Is there a role for history in the medical education, and in particular the history of racism and discrimination against Jewish people, against Black people, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's, you're right, it's crowded. And I think that's part of what the supporters of Dr. Goldfarb's article would say, is that, we need to be teaching cutting edge science instead of paying attention to these other issues. I would say it absolutely is our responsibility. It's our lane, similar to the gun issues. This is the physician's lane to make sure that we're not repeating historical mistakes that lead to, inequities for our patients and also for ourselves as a profession. I do think that it's important to tie it to what's happening now and future, instead of just looking back and saying this was terrible and we're not going to do that again, but to actually say this is also happening. For example, when we do biological essentialism for race-based testing, the GFR change that happened in many hospitals and hopefully all hospitals now is something that's been in place for a really long time and could be an example of saying this is where we assign a biological difference when there wasn't one, because of from the earlier definition of racism that was shown about saying that one group was superior to another biologically, and just really calling that out along the way. At CU and many other schools, we actually modeled it after a program that Columbia was doing, has an equity box that can be immediately, an equity bias box that can immediately go to our Associate Dean of Diversity and Office of Diversity Inclusion if a student or a faculty member identifies anytime we didn't have enough. One example this week was related to the diversity of images in our dermatology lectures. While they had improved, they weren't as diverse as they should have been, and students were able to immediately have a comment about it, and we could obtain supplementary material and also change things going forward for the next year. Similarly, if a physician or a lecturer states a comment that there are differences in outcomes based on race or racial differences, and they don't explain why those differences exist, and include things like the determinants of health or racism or structures that are in place that lead to those disparities, the students can also put that immediately into a comment box. And so we have a toolkit that we use to try to help the faculty understand, if you're going to be giving a lecture, you should be asking yourself these questions. Did I talk about racial differences without explaining why? Did I use diverse images in my slide presentations, et cetera? Obviously, those are small things that can be done, but it starts to lead to a culture change where we're talking about this all the time, and empowers the students to also bring it up. And it's not just Black students who are bringing this forward, it's allies, or we call them activator students as well, who are saying, this is not acceptable, this is not how we want to learn, this is not how we're going to take the best care of our patients in the future.
I want to turn for just a moment, because we're pretty much out of time, and I know Helen Morris is on the line. She is the inspiration for this program today, and really an inspirational person in general. And I'm wondering, Helen, if you have any reflections on what you've heard today, and in terms of moving forward with this program.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Well, I want to thank all of the presenters, because I think this has been an outstanding discussion. I just want to make one small comment. We've talked about racism. We haven't mentioned sexism, and sexism has also been a major blind spot in medical education. When I went to medical school, and that's a long time ago, there were 5% women who were admitted to medical school. 15, 20 years later, it was less than 10% women. Now there's been a sea change, and we're seeing about half the students, or even more than half the students, who are women, but women are still way behind with respect to appointments in medical school, appointments, leadership roles in medical school. I think, so that's one other comment that I'd like to make. I also recognize, just from my own history, that it doesn't take a written document to enforce a quota system or anything of that kind. It happens in an unwritten fashion, where individuals are discriminated against for a variety of reasons. When I went to medical school, I was part of the quota system for women, and I was part of the quota system for Jews. And yet, as I reflect on it, at least and I'm a graduate of this medical school, as a Jew, I did not feel any discrimination once I was in medical school. I cannot say the same thing about my experiences as a woman. As a woman, I was excluded from a whole variety of events. I was not welcome in many situations. And so I think education is important, and I am delighted at how this conversation is going. I also want to take just 1 second to express my hopes and prayers for Bill Silvers, who was very actively involved in putting this program together. We wish you well, Bill.
Thank you so much, Helen. And we are all hoping and praying for Bill's recovery. I want to remind folks that this whole program will be available by recording, and we will send it out to everyone who registered. It will also be posted on our website. We also asked each of the panelists if they would send us a few salient citations or references to the work that they were going to be talking about today. We'll put those together and send those out as well to everyone who registered. We do have a keynote address tomorrow afternoon as part of our Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program that will feature Dr. Aletha Maybank. She will then reprise that same talk on Wednesday at noon for medical grand rounds. So thank you in advance to Dr. Maybank for all of the work that she will be putting in this week for our programs. And a final reminder that this program, the American Jewish Experience in Medicine, will continue in the fall. And so if you'd like to be on the mailing list for this, just check that box on our website, and we'll make sure that you get notification when the next part of the American Jewish Experience in Medicine program takes place. Finally, there will be a post-event survey, and we really take those very seriously. So if you can just take a minute to fill out the post-event survey, we will very much appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who joined on the panel, in the audience. Of course, we had many questions we didn't get to. We will incorporate those into future programs. Thank you all so much for that.